Well, this is tricky because, morality, how can I say, is kind of one of the older issues. And if you're at all involved in the secular community, or if you're a self-proclaimed atheist, I'm sure you've heard it all before. You've argued about it before. You've had people say to you, well, where do you get your morals? And so I don't, forgive me if I'm bringing up old arguments here, but hopefully you'll find something new. Because my goal here is not to stick philosophical, but to get sociological and anthropological, if that helps. Because I find most discussions of morality and theism, or religion and morality, or atheism and morality, tend to stick in the philosophical realm, this is great. It's interesting. It's fun. When I have insomnia, it helps me go to sleep. So I appreciate it, but I'm going to try to move into the more real-world implications of secular morality. Okay, because, and by that I mean, I guess when I look at how people approach morality, it's sort of the more philosophical are how and I'm not a philosopher, I don't have a degree in philosophy, but it seems to be like deep thinkers sitting in their offices, reading other deep thinkers, and then writing more deep thought. And that's awesome. I actually am reading philosophy right now. Andrew Fiala might be a great guest speaker. He's a professor of philosophy and ethics at Cal State Fresno. He's written a book called Against Religion, War, and the State: The Case for Atheism, Pacifism, and Anarchism. So I'm enjoying it. Fiala, F-I-A-L-A, and it's a really it's very well clearly articulated. To me, that's like the number one goal of philosophy, right? Is it clearly articulated? And that's why I don't read a lot of philosophy. But when you find philosophy that is clearly articulated, it's awesome. So Fiala, he's a really great guy. But I look at when I mean like the sociology of morality or the anthropology of morality, I mean two things. One, I mean, how do non-philosophers establish their morality and construct it? So they're not taking philosophy classes, they're not reading these deep thinkers, they're just living their lives, but they are constructing a morality. So how do they do that? And then I mean, how does it play itself out in the real world? Do we see any actual results? Got it? So let's see. The first thing I did then in my research was I started to talk to actual secular men and women who were non-philosophers and ask them how they construct their morality. And most actually don't have much to say on it. It's not something they spend an inordinate amount of time talking about. They don't have, set arguments ready at their elbow to present. But I want to share two individuals, Milton, he's 46 years old, and Sonia, who's in her 60s. In my interviews with them, because I've been interviewing a lot of secular people around the country for my new book, and this is just one of the things I've talked to them about. They were able to articulate their morality, I think, in really interesting and helpful ways. So I'll share what they had to say as kind of illustrations of how non-philosopher secular people express it, and then we'll see how this plays itself out. So let's start with Milton. Like I said, he's 46 years old, he's from back east, and his take on secular morality, which I found really, really useful, especially when talking to, Republicans or something. He said, if you base your morality on your belief in God, you are guilty of moral outsourcing. Liked that. I liked that phrase. So I asked him to elaborate. For Milton, morality is basically, right, most people will agree, it's about the decisions and choices you personally make for yourself based on contemplation, weighing of options, understanding alternatives, accepting possible consequences, and navigating given complex life questions via your own conscience. Right? So really, morality is about listening to your own inner moral compass about what's wrong, what's right, what's just, what's unjust, what's compassionate, what's cruel. But if God is the source of your morality, then you don't have to consult your inner moral compass. You simply are looking to God for direction. And that's basically absolving yourself of the heavy lifting of moral deliberation. It's obedience to a higher authority. It's seeking moral guidance elsewhere outside of oneself. And I thought of this when I was watching the movie what was it called? It was that amazing movie from Iran. I think it was nominated for Best Picture. It should have won if it didn't 2 years ago. It was about this couple, The Separation, maybe it was called. A Separation. I don't know if you remember, but in Iran today, you can speed dial from your phone direct to imams who will answer any moral quandary you have in the moment. So you can be sitting in your house, oh, I don't know what to do, speed dial, yes, well, my daughter did this, what does Sharia law tell me to do in this instance? I don't know how to do, and then the imam will tell you. And I thought this was an amazing illustration of kind of theistic morality in action. Like, you don't have to look inward, you simply look out to somebody else, an authority, either an invisible authority or someone on your speed phone, to tell you how to navigate what can be complex or difficult life questions. For secular people, that's a major cop-out. I mean, that's a major issue, right? That's deferring the moral decision-making, and if you're secular, you have no such cop-outs, right? Godlessness means that you have to make up your own choices about how to treat others, how to live your life in a way that reflects your own personal conscience. That, a lot of secular people would argue, is perhaps true morality. So in the words of philosopher and humanist Stephen Law from Britain, he says, "It is our individual responsibility to make our own moral judgments, rather than attempt to hand that responsibility over to some external authority." Now, one obvious benefit of secular morality, embraced or articulated by people like Milton, at the larger societal level, it's less likely to lead to blind obedience to those in positions of authority. It's less likely to lead to herd-like behavior. It's less likely to lead to mob mentality. And history has repeatedly shown that when too many people in a given society abdicate moral responsibility and look to an outside authority for that, ignoring their own inner conscience, and rather giving their moral direction up to some outside external source, the results are quite nasty and bloody. Think about Erich Fromm's great book, Escape from Freedom, right? And the thesis for Erich Fromm was, actually, freedom is scary to a lot of people. It's actually harder. It's easier to have mom or dad tell us what to do. We think we want independence from mom and dad, but when we get it, it's like, oh shit. Actually, we think we want democracy. Democracy's scary. Some people actually would rather have a leader, a dictator, tell us what to do. And the results are not pretty. So in fact, I would argue that a secular morality is necessary for a healthy democracy. It's necessary for healthy democracy. I mean, we have to take responsibility for our own morality. We can't outsource it. And if we do, we are in danger of losing what democracy is all about. Now, that's Milton's. Still a little bit philosophical. Now let me give you Sonia. Sonia's in her mid-60s. She was from Ohio. And she had an interesting spin. Non-philosopher here, not even an academic, but, actually maybe because she was involved in art, this is where this came about. She gave me a nice, I call it the eye in the ceiling hypothetical. She didn't use those words, but that's what I do. So I'm asking her, how do you, not, why are you moral, but how do you understand morality? So this was her take. She said, imagine a scenario where there's an exhibit at a museum. Well, let's say it's a traveling exhibit that goes to elementary schools to blow kids' minds about the possibilities of art. So they've got this room set up in an elementary school, and in it is a piece of art from this traveling exhibit. And it's this intricate piece of art full of branches and wires and glass and sparkly things and jangly things and webs, and it's like a Lee Montague times 10 psychedelic piece, and it dangles from a fishing wire, and it's 5 feet in diameter, and it's got bells and slinkies and plastic things, and it hangs there, and it's amazing. It blows your mind when you look at it. The Artist is dead who made it. It's a one of a kind. Really couldn't be replicated, and it's very fragile. So we take a child and we say to this 9-year-old kid, we take two kids, do a little hypothetical experiment. We take the first one and we say to the kid, look, we'd like you're going to go into this room by yourself to check out this piece of art. And you're going to be in there you get 10 minutes to just take it all in. No one's going to be in that room with you. But please don't touch it. I know it's really interesting, and I know you want to touch it, but we really don't want you to touch it. And we'll give you reasons why. It's one of a kind. The person who made it is dead. It's very fragile. If you touch it, you could break it. You could get some oil on it. You could alter it, and then other people wouldn't be able to enjoy it. So we'd really like you just not to touch it. Please just look at your eyes. Now, if you do touch it, and nothing happens, we won't know. We'll be honest with you, we won't know. But you might stain something, you might break something, you might scratch something. So we'd really, really like you not to touch it. And we'll see you in 10 minutes. Kid goes in, doesn't touch it, checks it out, is blown away, and leaves. Now we get the second kid. And we say to this kid, same deal, amazing piece of art, you got 10 minutes, please, go on in, enjoy. However, we don't want you to touch it because it's fragile, but there's a hole in the ceiling. And the school principal is going to be watching your every move the whole time. His eye is going to be on you, and it is a he. And if you touch it, we'll beat the shit out of you. But if you don't touch it, you're going to get, candy and popcorn and $100 and movie theater tickets and a new iPad and all that. So go on in, enjoy the piece of art. Remember, the eye is watching you. If you touch it, we'll beat the shit out of you. And if not, you get all these presents. Kid goes in, doesn't touch, comes out, woo, gets the prize. Fine. Now, for a lot of secular people like Sonia, the first experience represents secular morality. The kid makes a choice not to touch the piece of art because she understands the risks of doing so, the harm that could come from it, and the value of what is before her. So she chooses what is right, not out of fear of punishment or not out of hope of reward, and not because she's ever mindful of this all-watching eye. The second kid for Sonia represents theistic morality, religious morality, right? This kid makes a choice maybe because of the intrinsic value of the art, but most likely because he's being watched the whole time, doesn't want to get the shit kicked out of him and wants the presents. For Sonia, that's actually not really morality. That's just being obedient, maybe fearful, prudent, or greedy. Now, granted, in both cases, both kids did the right thing. They didn't touch the fragile piece of art. But I would agree with Sonia that if we as individuals, when placed in morally ambiguous or potentially precarious ethical situations, if we make certain moral choices because we think the eye of God is watching us and we seek to avoid personal punishment while attaining personal rewards, we aren't being truly moral. However, if we make such choices based on our own volition, looking at our own inner moral compass, I would argue that's truly moral. But there's more. In Sonia's hypothetical situation, the child who is only acting morally because of the eye on the ceiling engages in exactly what Milton described, moral outsourcing, right? He's not using his own inner moral compass, but is looking outward at this powerful eye watching. And furthermore, if we raise children with that type of morality, what happens to them if they ever begin to doubt that eye in the ceiling's existence? Are we now looking at an actively, dysfunctional moral individual who has no practice or sense of using their inner moral compass? And I would argue that the secular morality that Sonia describes lends itself to rational decision making, unavoidable self-reflection, and perhaps most importantly, empathetic dispositions. Thank you very much. No, just kidding. Okay, now, if I just stop there, thank you. If I just stop there, right, I would be guilty of just spinning, waxing on. So now let's look and see, does secular morality have any real-world results? Thank you very much. No, okay, yes. So let's see. let's see. I've spent some time researching studies that try to get at people's moral decision-making, tries to get at certain indicators of moral behavior, and of course we could all disagree on what is moral and what isn't. It's subjective, to be sure. Sam Harris tries to get out of that. I don't know if he does it successfully, you tell me. But so let's look at let me convey to you what I have found in going through study after study after study after study. And I haven't gotten through everything. There's always something more, but we try. Why not start with, Clippers fans, racism? Okay. I think we can all agree what a poison it has been throughout history and continues to be today. And for all I know, Donald Sterling might be secular. I don't know. Who knows? You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, fascinating, right? Right on the heels of that guy in Nevada, right? Did you see Bill Maher's take on that Cliven guy in Nevada? Fascinating. Anyway. Now, before I say this, I want to be really clear here. And CQView has actually helped me a lot with this, her work, and I've heard her speak. I certainly do not want to stand here as a white person in front of a mostly white audience and say, hey, secular people are less racist. Yeah, that's awesome. And I don't want to imply that secularity is some panacea to racism, or that just becoming secular suddenly washes away racism. Racism is so intrinsic to American history. It's so pervasive in our culture. Just last night, I was watching an old Clint Eastwood movie, kind of like, it was called The Outlaw Jimmy something or other, and the opening shot was like white guy farming his soil, blonde kid, blonde wife, marauders come in, kill the wife and daughter, and burn the house down, and of course they're darker. They weren't African American, but they were darker. And so from the Disney movies that my kids watch, all the way up to, you always see that association. It's part of our pop culture, it's part of our history. So that said, and that understood and acknowledged, I did find it interesting. I found a study by Deborah Hall and several other professors out of Duke University and also USC, where they looked at they did a meta-analysis. They looked at 55 separate studies trying to look at the relationship between religiosity, secularity, and racist opinions or inclinations. So, what did they find? The most interesting finding to me was that strongly religious Americans tend to be the most racist on various indicators. Moderately religious Americans tend to be a little less racist, and yet the group of Americans found to be the least racist of all were secular Americans, particularly those who self-identified as agnostic. Now, again, I don't want to make too much of this, but it was, I think, pretty fascinating. Many psychologists who study race and religion have noticed this over the years. So, for example, Wood, Hill, and Spilka, who kind of wrote the book on the psychology of religion, it's in multiple editions, quote, and they argue, based on their assessment of decades of research, quote, as a broad generalization, the more religious an individual it is the more prejudiced that person is. Now, this might help explain why secular white people were more likely than religious white people to support the civil rights movement, and why secular white South Africans were more likely to be against apartheid than religious white South Africans. So again, just a correlation. Don't want to pat myself on the back too hard. We've got to be vigilant. We've got to be more aware. We've got problems of racism in our own movements, but I thought this study was at least somewhat hopeful or nice to read. How about feelings about torture? You would think that all those Christians that went to see the Passion of the Christ might have thought, ooh, bad. I mean, I know my mother-in-law, born-again Christian, she was like, that was the most powerful experience of my life, I'm like, you should see the stoning of Soroya M. But anyway, so I said, okay, the Passion of the Christ, wow, you watch this guy your Savior get tortured at the hands of a government, right? So you would think Christians would be the first people in this country to be like, torture by a government, bad idea. Well, our born-again Christian president, George W. Bush, recent past president, in the aftermath of 9/11, began allowing torture at the hands of U.S. federal agents, prisoners suspected of terrorism. So national surveys asked Americans, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about the U.S. government torturing people? And what do we find? Those who were most supportive of the government using torture were the most religious. Those who were a little less religious, more moderate religious people, were less supportive, and yet that swath of Americans who was most adamantly opposed to the use of torture by a government were secular Americans, particularly atheists. The death penalty. I always thought one of the cardinal virtues of Christianity was mercy. I mean, their own Savior was executed. And yet, who supports the death penalty most? Important exception for African Americans who tend to be strongly Christian and oppose the death penalty. But when you look among white Americans, the majority of Americans, you find that the more religious tend to support the death penalty more, and the more secular tend to support the death penalty less. Furthermore, secular people are less likely to be vengeful in psychological studies than their religious peers, and they're also likely to be less nationalistic, less likely to think, our country's the best. Secular people, which is, again, kind of ironic, because the world religions are always talking about the brotherhood of man, the sisterhood of woman, that we're all one, we're all God's children has to be one of the most common metaphors you'll read in the Bible. And yet, who's most likely to think our team's best? Religious people. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. Measures of militarism. Who is most likely to support strong military, spending for military, even military actions and invasions of other countries, right? The religious among us, particularly Mormons in this case, who were the most supportive of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan of any demographic in the country. Christians and evangelicals are the most supportive of going to war against other nations. In fact, not only do we have data on this for Iraq, but even Vietnam. Christians were the most supportive of invading or Agent Oranging and chemically bombing Vietnamese people, and the secular, the least supportive of military aggression, the least supportive of the invasion of Iraq and of Afghanistan, the least supportive of our heinous crimes in Vietnam. So secular people are also more likely, this is interesting, to be tolerant of those they disagree with. So people are asked, would you allow, for example, a teacher to give a talk whose views you strongly disagree with on X, Y, and Z? Would you allow a speech to be given in City Hall by someone who supports this position that's in opposition to your position, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Religious people are far less likely to want to allow people of a different opinion to have a public forum. Secular people are far more willing to say yes. They have a right to speak too. How about protecting the environment? Again, religious Americans, especially the more stronger, tend to be the least in favor of protecting the environment, while secular Americans, particularly atheists and agnostics, are the most supportive of protecting planet Earth and to take seriously the catastrophic threat of global warming. Women's equality. We see this correlation again and again. Secular Americans are more likely to support education for women, women earning their own living, women not being submissive, women having greater freedoms than the religious. Gay rights. There is no organized secular opposition to gay rights. There is no organized secular opposition to gay marriage. It is solely a religious problem. Solely. Unbelievable. How about this one? Beating children. How about that for morality? Hitting a 3-year-old with your 45-year-old fist. How about that? Religious people are, on average, much more supportive of corporal punishment, while secular people are the most likely to be against it. How about this one? There is no room at the inn. How many people heard that in their 3rd grade Christmas play, right? Joseph and Mary were looking for a place to stay. They were told there's no room at the inn, so they couldn't go. Oh, how sad. Those people that wouldn't let them in, how awful. Guess who's most likely to tell non-Americans or non-American citizens, there's no room at this inn? Oh, you're coming from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador? There's no room at this inn. Strongly religious Americans are the most oppositional against offering paths to legal citizenship or opening up to those non-documented citizens here, and secular people are the most open to allowing paths of amnesty and opening for citizenship and allowing non-documented or undocumented individuals full citizenship rights. Suffering of animals. Secular people are far more likely to be attuned to that than religious people. So, when it comes to a host of issues, from torture to war, global warming, gay rights, the rights of the undocumented, suffering of animals, etc., secular people appear, at least in the soft science of the social sciences here, appear to be, I would argue, more morally attuned and more ethical than their religious counterparts. But what might be the ultimate example of this? Committing morality. Committing violent crimes. Violent crimes. Aggravated assault. Murder. What do we find? Atheists are grossly underrepresented in our nation's prisons today, with some reports suggesting that atheists make up less than half of 1% of all Americans held behind bars today. As Professor Benjamin Beit Halachmi out of Israel has concluded, psychology professor, quote, ever since the field of criminology got started and data were collected of the religious affiliation of criminal offenders, the fact that the unaffiliated and the non-religious had the lowest crime rates has been noted. I'm starting to think we're seeing a case of projection. Those who associate atheism with immorality, maybe something's going on here, some insecurity. Let's go from the individual level to the state level. Let's look at the United States. We can compare the 10 least religious states with the highest proportions of secular citizens to the 10 most religious states. So the top 10 states with the highest levels of faith in God, the highest levels of fear of that eye in the ceiling are Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, tied with Utah. And those states with the lowest levels of belief in God, the lowest rates of church attendance, the lowest rates of prayer, study of the Bible, etc., are Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, Alaska, Oregon, and California. Portland was recently dubbed the least Christian city in America. Yay, okay. So what do we find? When we look at homicide rates, violent crime rates, domestic abuse rates, funding for schools and hospitals, etc., the least theistic states in America tend to fare much better, much better than the most theistic states. Heck, we can even simply look at which states have the highest rates of child abuse fatalities. I mean, can you imagine a more heinous act of immorality? Beating to death the child that you are caring for as a parent or grandparent or guardian. And what do we find? The rates of kids being beaten to death by their own parents are markedly higher among the most God-fearing states and significantly lower among the most God-indifferent. For example, the child abuse fatality rate in Mississippi is twice that of New Hampshire's, and the child fatality abuse rate in Kentucky is 4 times that of Oregon's. Let's go international. I present to you Ingmar. Where are you? Okay. Let's look at, and this, I'm sure you're familiar with this, so I won't belabor this point. I've been talking about this for a few years now. But the most faithful nations on earth, countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Philippines, Pakistan, Morocco, Egypt, Zimbabwe, Bangladesh, El Salvador, Colombia, Senegal, Malawi, Indonesia, Brazil, Peru, Jordan, Algeria, Ghana, Venezuela, etc., Sierra Leone, etc. And when you look at those countries, and then let's look at the least religious, the least theistic, the most secular countries like Sweden, Denmark, Czech Republic, Japan, Canada, Norway, Finland, New Zealand, South Korea, Estonia, France, Russia, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Slovenia, Germany, Hungary, Great Britain, Australia, Belgium, etc., we can look at so many indicators. Let's just take peacefulness as one, for example. The Vision of Humanity is a nonprofit organization that publishes an annual global peace index. They calculate numerous variables that indicate peacefulness or the lack thereof in a given society. They look at things like safety and security for citizens, levels of violent crime, warfare, ease of access to dangerous weapons, etc., And what do they find? The most peaceful nations on earth are among the most secular, and the least peaceful nations on earth are among the most religious. Places like Colombia that have among the highest homicide rates consistently in the world. Take, for example, then, murder. What do we find? Those states with the highest murder rates, Colombia, El Salvador, Brazil, tend to be among the most religious, and those countries that have the lowest murder rates, places like Sweden, Japan, Norway, and the Netherlands, are among the more secular. We could look at all kinds of indicators: corruption in government, corruption in business, aggravated assault rates, access to health care, degree of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, environmental degradation, degrees of inequality, etc., etc., etc. And aside from the extremely important but outlying exception of suicide, religious societies, of course, are doing much worse than the more secular societies, which fare so much better, I would argue, in institutionalizing their morality. So, what's the conclusion? Clearly, secular morality works in the real world. It works at the individual level for people like Sonia and Milton, or the studies I've talked about. It works at the state level when comparing those societies that have higher rates of secularity than those, and it works at the international level when comparing those countries that are the most secular to those that are the least. Now, I understand correlation is not causation. I understand there are many factors that make for an ethical society. I understand there are many factors that make for a moral culture. But I would argue that we must own the part that secularism plays. I'll give you 3 examples. The fight for women's equality and women's rights was and continues to be spearheaded by more secular-minded individuals. They seem to go hand in hand, even in bad examples like the Soviet Union, not my favorite illustration of secularism. And yet even there, women's rights was prominent, a priority. Gay rights. The fight for gay rights is spearheaded by more secular-minded individuals. And I think this is something we don't talk about enough, but it's one of the greatest injustices on planet Earth. And that is the caste system, and caste degradation, and caste segregation, and caste oppression in India, the second most populated country in the world. Who fights most against caste inequality? Secular Indians. I'm not saying religious Indians don't as well. Gandhi certainly did too. But Nehru and others, and those in the Indian rationalist and skeptic societies, are fighting the most against caste injustice from a decidedly secular perspective. So these are but a few examples of the ways in which a rational, secular approach to life has real-world benefits. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Yeah, I stay here.
He stays here. Anybody who wants to ask questions, line up as usual over there. Buck, you're going to be, yes, the microphone, Nazi. Sorry to use that. He's the enforcer, yes. Microphone is there.
Come on, I know this is a tough crowd. Lay into me here.
Hello. I just a couple ground rules. Only I touch the mic. If you go on for too long, I will cut you off. A lot of people have questions. Please be respectful. All right, first up. I touch the mic.
Hi, my name is Errol. Now, I just have a question in regards to Oregon's correlation between atheism, secularism, and racism, because as far as I know, Oregon is actually a relatively monoculture in terms of race. It is predominantly white people. So that is a little bit of a contradiction, that...
Question?
Well, just in terms of that contradiction, how that could be the case that they're supposedly very tolerant towards different races, etc., if they're a monoculture.
Yeah, thanks for that. That is a good one. That's where sociologists have their work cut out for them. I mean, how do we understand these things? I lived in Oregon for 10 years. It's a very white state. In fact, the Oregon state constitution made it illegal for African Americans to live there. I think up until the 1930s, that was on the books, where you couldn't physically spend the night in Oregon. Interestingly enough, it was so white that when I went to the University of Oregon archives and read the Ku Klux Klan newspapers from the 20s, they didn't even talk about black people. You know who they talked about? Catholics. It's all they cared about, Catholics, these papists. I mean, I was so interested in looking about the roots of racism in Oregon, so I go to the Ku Klux Klan newspapers and the archives, and it's all about Catholics. I mean, that's how it's one of the whitest states in the country. There's a lot of neo-Nazis in certain parts of Oregon, and yet in the major metropolitan areas, so that would be, Oregon is basically 2 societies, Portland and Eugene, and Ashland, and the rest of the state. But in fact, 1 million people alone are in Portland. Another 1 million live everywhere else. So it's really, Portland and Eugene comprise the majority of the citizens of Oregon. And so the only way I could explain it is that it's a lot of liberal white people. So that doesn't mean they're not racist, but maybe it expresses itself differently. So that would be my best guess.
Okay, I don't want to monopolize.
Yes, wouldn't you say that the results of these studies are not at all surprising because they're based on books and morality that are thousands and thousands of years old?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, in other words, like the Bible. I mean, it's,
Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying?
I see.
That was moral back then, but
I see.
society has changed so much
That's
in thousands
right.
of years.
Absolutely, and that's a really strong argument to make as well. Why would we base our morality on the thoughts and notions of people 2,000, 3,000 years ago? Yeah, absolutely. You bet. Thank you for that.
Could you just flesh out the suicide outlier? You
Yeah.
went over it really fast. It was the outlier compared to all the other peacefulness factors.
Exactly. So Gregory S. Paul has put together like a successful society scale, something like 50 variables from teen pregnancy rates to STD rates to alcohol to domestic violence to domestic abuse. I mean, looking at how to study societies. And the reason is only suicide, well, there is an exception, which I can also explain, but basically suicide is the one area where religious cultures, religious countries do much better on having lower suicide rates than more secular countries and cultures. So how do we explain this? This is actually the question that the very first study of sociology took on, and that was Emile Durkheim's suicide, 1897. He wrote this. This was his second work after he got his dissertation, when sociology was just starting out, trying to look at how do we account for different suicide rates. His main finding was this: when people are more strongly bound to other people, when there's strong social bonding, social networks, when people are literally physically more connected to more people, those societies have lower suicide rates. The more individualism you have in a society, where people are more cut off from others, are more likely to not be married, not have kids, not be part of organizations, when social capital goes down and social connectedness goes down, suicide rates tend to go up. So, for instance, rich people always have higher suicide rates than poor people. Always, across the board. Doesn't matter what race, what class, what society. Rich people. Why? The goal of being rich, right, is to get away from people. That's why you are rich, right? If you're poor, you live in a tenement, there's someone above you, below you, next to you. You get a little bit more money, you can move to a house. Now you only have neighbors here, here, and here, and that sucks too. So you get a little richer, and you move to a house that's like just surrounded by woods, and you're at the end of a driveway. That kind of sucks too. So you get richer, and you get an island. Yes, the goal of every rich person, right? If you're poor, you have to take a bus. If you're a little bit richer, you can fly. But if you're really rich, you can go into the first class, which separates you from the riffraff. But if you're really rich, you have a private jet, so you don't have to be near no one. So the more you isolate yourself from people, the more likely you are to off yourself, and the more embedded you are with other people. So, truth be told, secularism and secularity are highly correlated with individualism. That's just a fact. It's a sociological fact. Societies that are more individualistic tend to have higher rates of secularity, and people that are secular tend to be less likely to be joiners. So that's how I understand it. I think it's related to individualism.
So it would be interesting to see if those numbers start trending down, considering what we're starting to see.
That's right. Go to Sunday Assembly. You won't kill yourself. Okay. Yes.
You gave many examples of where secularists are in our estimation, more unethical than very religious people. And my question is why. I grew up with the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule, do unto others, and so I think most religious people have the same values. Why the difference? Why are they less ethical and moral?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Next? No. It is messy, and I can't say for sure, so I can speculate. Now, I'd like to think my speculations are based in something here. Okay, I think there's two things going on. Number one, secular morality really is reducible to one thing, and that's treating other people the way you want to be treated. There's really not much else there. It's not about don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. Most religious people also get that golden rule, but they get a lot of other stuff too. Don't do this, do that, don't do this. And there's a tendency to institute a kind of respect for authority, be it in the priest, be it in the pastor, be it in the rabbi. I do believe that if you're taught that there's a God and a devil and angels and demons and heaven and hell, I think that hinders and thwarts a healthy ethical orientation. And I base that on, Lawrence Kohlberg was a major psychology professor out of Harvard who studied the development of morality in humans. And he spent years doing this. And he basically noticed that almost all humans tend to pass through, I think it was 8 stages of moral development as they get older. When you're really, really little, you associate something bad if you can get punished for it. If you can get punished for it, it's bad. That's as far as your mind can tell. At a certain point, you get to higher stages of, maybe this is wrong because those who know better tell me it's wrong. Then you move out of that, and you move up, and you move up, and you move up to a place where you understand wrong or right in a sort of universal, ethical orientation that isn't about punishment, isn't about authority. And I would argue that religious indoctrination of children tends to be stuck in a very low level of morality based on reward and punishment. I could be wrong, but I do think there's something going on there. For instance, who's more likely to hit their kids? I think it's interesting that religious people are more likely to hit their kids than secular people. And what countries today outlaw, you cannot hit your child in Sweden. It's against the law, not just in public, anywhere. It's against the law. Sweden has one of the lowest rates of theism in the history of the world. So I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think there is a difference. I'm not so sure that, for example, I'll just end here. The studies on child rearing among secular, which are coming out now, show secular parents are much more likely to want to cultivate autonomy and independent thinking in their children rather than obedience to authority, which is much more strongly correlated with strong religiosity. And of course, there's a continuum among, I don't want to group all religious people together. There's a huge difference between Episcopalians and Jehovah's Witnesses. Let's keep that, our Quakers and Pentecostals. But on average, the more religious you are, the more you are likely to foster obedience in your children. The more secular you are, the more likely you are to foster independence of thought. So I think something's going on there. I can't prove it yet, but I'm trying. I'll get there. Okay, yes.
Just a quick side note. I've been wearing the wrong name tag, so Klaus, if you're here, I have that. Sorry.
I understand that aside from suicide, that the other area that we lack compared to theists is charitable giving. Has any new results come out that showing that maybe that giving to the churches, that's really where they actually pull ahead of us as opposed to nonprofits in general, or is it really just an overall they are better than us?
Thank you. I forgot to put that in my notes. I should have addressed that head on rather than evade it suspiciously. Okay, thank you. No, I just flailed on that. Okay. There is a lot of stuff on this, and Putnam's latest book addresses this head on. Let me try to summarize it. It does appear that on average, religious people tend to give more money and more time to charitable organizations than secular people. Now, let's qualify that. Obviously, if people are just giving to their own religious organization, does that count? So some researchers have tried to control for that. It seems as though when you control for, are you just giving back to your own church, the difference between religious generosity and secular generosity shrinks, but not completely. So even when we're just looking at who gives just to secular organizations, not religious organizations, but to secular organizations, religious people are still slightly, but significantly, but slightly more likely to give to secular organizations time and money than secular people are. However, it gets very interesting. Theism doesn't seem to be the ingredient. It's being part of a community that is. So they control for that. And what do they find? Strongly theistic people who aren't churchgoers, who aren't members of a religious community, their giving is way down. And atheists who are members of religious organizations because their husband or wife is, or for whatever reason, they like the music, their giving is just as high as religious people. So it seems to be being embedded in a religious framework that provides relentless opportunity, right? I mean, if you're told, hey, we're all going to have a blood drive. Come on, let's do this together. So if every week you're being told about some book drive, food drive, blood drive, so it's the opportunity is more there if you're religiously engaged. The peer pressure is more there if you're religiously engaged. So it seems to be a function of group association and not so much a function of theism or atheism. But that said, they do still do better than secular people on average. It's not huge, but it's consistent. So we got our work cut out for it.
Donation box at the front.
Yes. There we go. Let's show them. All right. I'll keep going here. You let me know when you're sick of hearing me. Okay.
Would it be factual to state that all wars are fought in the name of God? Both sides believe they're fighting for God. Or is there one exception?
That's a good question. I'm not a historian. I don't think it's the case that all wars are fought in the name of God. I don't think the Vietnam War was about whose God is better. I don't think the French Revolution, is that a war? Civil War. I don't know if the Civil War in America was fought over God. I think both sides thought God was on their side, but this was not about whose version of God was going to win. It was about slavery. I'd like to think. But I do agree that in war, the religious tend to line up and bless their own sides, for sure. Last question. How about that?
Hi, I'm Bernard. I was just wondering if you, in your studies, looked at and found anything with either monodirectional or bidirectional relationships between poverty and social problems and religiosity or religion.
Yeah, you bet. That's a pretty straightforward one. Pretty simple. Where poverty is more widespread, religiosity is stronger. Where poverty is weak, religion is weak. Straight up. And you can do that at the international level, the state level, the county level. You can just do it. You can control for race, educational attainment, gender. There's no question that poverty is a fertile ground for religious faith. And when poverty is eradicated or strongly limited, people tend to be less religious. And I will say, if I may mention Karl Marx, he actually felt like obsessing about atheism at the philosophical level was the wrong approach. He didn't think you were ever going to get a religion out of there by like chipping away at it philosophically. You had to chip away at the social sources of theism. You had to chip away at the social circumstances that give rise to religion. And that was things like poverty. And so he argued if you really wanted to get rid of religion, cut it at the root. Don't just argue with its manifestations, which is, I think, pretty powerful. Because it's a hell of a lot easier to argue with the here. That's a lot funner and a lot easier. But actually rooting out poverty, that's tougher. But not impossible. Very possible, as we've seen many societies that were among the poorest nations in the Western world, at least 150 years ago, are now have the lowest poverty rates in the world. Scandinavia, for example. Yes, next.
A religion has an enemy, and that enemy is science. And it turns out that your scientific knowledge and would correlate with people who are not necessarily religious. And religion, as a matter of fact, has been trying to suppress
Question, please.
Creation science and a number of other gimmicks.
So comment, thank you.
Yes, indeed. I myself believe in intelligent design, but no, just kidding. Okay, sorry. I like to be, mix things up a bit. Yes, amen. No comment. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for giving us the lecture. That was great. And I hope you guys stay around and mingle and meet new people. We want to build a strong community. And maybe we'll encourage you to donate some money to us. And if not today, consider donating online. make sure that you talk to our Black Skeptics Los Angeles scholarship winner. He's gonna stick around as well. And yay! Thank you, Phil.